What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Welcome to a complete history of Kassadin, the Voidwalker. Although he might not be in the best spot right now, he has an incredible history of changes throughout the years, some very exciting moments, and a whole lot of nerfs. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to hit that like button, and if you don't enjoy the video, please click the dislike, and if this video hits 15,000 ratings, I'll make another champion history. Anyways, let's get started. There's a place between dimensions known as the Void, filled with unspeakable things, and although most knowledge of the Void has been lost, there are many who have unwittingly gazed into the beyond, unable to turn away. Kassadin was once a man forced to look upon the Void, and was forever changed by what he saw. Initially a seeker of forbidden knowledge, he sought out the Void and discovered that it was something else entirely. He's one of very few men to have entered to the lost city of Acathia and lived to tell the tale. But within the city he found secrets that threatened to consume him forever, so in order to survive he let the Void inside of him, and miraculously he was able to overcome the alien urges and emerged as the Voidwalker. Now he protects Valoran from the terrors of the Void in hopes that no one further will be consumed by the darkness. Hope you guys enjoyed that little lore segment, and the actual history begins during the very early phases of League of Legends, where a character known as Kassadin began development as a part of the original group of 40 champions that League of Legends started with. Headed by Ezreal, the designer who worked on champions such as Ahri, Aurelia, and Nocturne, and voiced by Adam Harrington. Not unlike a lot of the other original 40 champions, Kassadin's design took heavy inspiration from a hero from Defense of the Ancients, the first ever MOBA, known as the Anti-Mage, who was a hyper-mobile anti-caster hero that involved blinking around, damaging people based on their mana pools, and using powerful anti-magic shields. Although Kassadin and the Anti-Mage have somewhat different gameplay, they have fairly similar concepts, and there's no doubt that Kassadin at least took some inspiration from what was a pretty interesting hero from Defense of the Ancients. Upon his completion on August 7th, 2009, Kassadin was released as the 29th champion in League of Legends, after Veigar and right before Gangplank and Taric. Although the overall power level of champions in the beta was generally quite higher than it is today, he was without a doubt overpowered on release, as a dominant anti-mage champion who brought insane mobility and some awesome burst damage to the table, as well as a targeted silence on his Q and the ability to steal mana on hit using his W. Riftwalk also had a huge range and could be cast while rooted, and a cooldown of 3 seconds, and his Force Pulse only took 4 abilities to charge up, not to mention the higher AP ratios and base damage overall across the board, with his passive giving him bonus attack speed as well when taking damage from abilities. And, well, it wasn't too hard to figure out his strength, and then the patch immediately following his release, which was only 5 days later, he received a hefty nerf to his ultimate, increasing the cooldown, mana cost, and the time frame for stacking additional casts. But he was still pretty crazy after that, and so on the next patch again he received a nerf, and again on the next patch after that. So in under 30 days from his release, Kassadin had already been nerfed 3 times. This put him at an okay spot for a bit of time, but in the early phases of League, the game was a lot different. Mobility was non-existent in most champions, which gave Kassadin a massive advantage over almost everyone, and along with the fact that he became the prime counterpick to mages, this paved the way for him to become a dominant champion. In early Season 1, his Force Pulse was finally nerfed, and although he had a huge mobility advantage over most champions at the time, the meta was to play an 80 carry in the mid lane, and an attack damage auto attack based champion is actually a little bit hard to lane against as Kassadin. So although he had a reasonably strong kit, he actually wasn't that popular until about a year and a half later when Season 1 was just starting. And on patch 96, we saw the first removal of utility from his kit, and making his W no longer steal % maximum mana from the target, but simply just restore mana on hit instead. Stealing mana from someone was a pretty crazy mechanic, and with the removal came another dip in popularity for our anti-mage friend, as it was regarded as a huge blow. Later on patch 99, he actually received his first buff, but immediately in the next patch after we saw another case of removal of his utility, as Riftwalk could no longer be cast while rooted. But I think we can all agree that was a pretty fair change. Kassadin received another series of buffs and nerfs that ultimately resulted in his W being reworked. Because the rest of his kit did less damage, the fact that his W just provided armor penetration started to shine through as a really strange element of a champion with mostly AP scaling, so it was changed to deal magic damage and also scale with AP. However, time proved that the damage values were actually still pretty small, as Kassadin struggled to succeed in the awkward Season 1 meta that didn't exactly favor him. So on patch 125, he received a pretty significant buff to his Force Pulse with a minor nerf on Null Sphere to shift some power off of his Q. With the beginning of Season 2 came the massive meta shift that would solidify the current League of Legends meta, and although Kassadin was already played in the mid lane due to his mobility and roaming, this is where we finally started to see his matchups in lane improved by a little bit. Eventually we saw a decent nerf to Rift Walk, increasing his cooldown by 1 second, and for a dozen patches afterwards he was in an alright spot, until his Rift Walk and Netherblade received significant AP ratio buffs in order to buff his late game. And now we head into the beginning of Season 3, where to kick off the new year, Expect Aeon Fnatic makes one of the most historic plays of all time. Let's take a moment to listen in.
In the base, you can see there's coming in there. Peke is desperately on towards the Nexus. Kevin is going to be able to go towards him. He's trying to do it, but meanwhile they're in the base. Yellow Star's trying to defend them in the base. Peke is trying to take the Nexus down. Is anyone going to be able to deal with this one? Catches him with another axe. He's very low on health right now. They're pushing on the Nexus to his Peke managed to get it. I do not believe it.
Man, I remember watching that happen live, and it really was so insane. One of the most exciting plays I've ever seen throughout my time watching League of Legends for sure. But outside of that incredible play, the first half of Season 3 would go on to be reasonably uneventful for Kassadin, as he received pretty much no changes. However, the introduction of Crystalline Flask and shifting around of the starting items in the preseason helped him out quite a lot, as it made it easier for him to survive the early game, so he was a pretty decent champion in Season 3 and saw some competitive play here and there while he became a popular ban/pick for lower rankings of play. Later into the season, on patch 3.13, he received a pretty major change that focused on increasing his risk versus his reward, making him less tanky but increasing the damage and utility on Rift Walk. This change also included a pretty decent buff to his early game silence, which would go on to prove to be quite costly, as this is the major change that boosted Kassadin into his insane level of dominance. The buff was intended to be a power neutral change that caused a little bit of a shift in his playstyle, but the silence buff improved his early game a ton, and the ultimate changes ended up just being a flat out buff because the mana refund was super impactful, while the removal of magic resistance was barely relevant at all. Before this change, he was already a pretty strong champion that saw some competitive play, but after this change he exploded into one of the most ridiculous cases of a champion we've ever seen. As Season 3 wrapped up, we saw Kassadin hit an 80% ban rate in solo queue, and as things continued a little bit into Season 4, we saw that number of his ban rate hit an insane 95%. And combined with his pick rate, we had a champion that was being banned or picked in 99.5% of games in solo queue, and maintained around the same level of popularity in competitive play. The combination of being overpowered as heck, but also incredibly frustrating to play against, led him to terrorize the ladder for over 4 months, and even a major nerf in patch 4.3 didn't really help much. On patch 4.4, he finally received his major rework, with the goal to make him less frustrating to play against, more risk versus reward based, and overall just more balanced, removing his silence, nerfing his passive, nerfing his damage across the board, and changing his W a little bit, increasing the mana cost on his ultimate, and generally overall just trying to be a massive nerf to Kassadin. For the most part, the rework was successful in that, as his win rate plummeted to about 42%. He received a buff in patch 4.6 to his W and Q damage, and shortly after this change, players began playing him in a tanky bruiser sort of playstyle, and he once again became really strong, although nowhere near as dominant as before. However, no champion in the entire game could keep up with the mobility of a Kassadin with his ultimate, and so he continued to be a powerful champion, as Riot decided that they didn't really want to change his ultimate too much, as they decided that it was his defining feature, and it's what made Kassadin Kassadin. Throughout the second half of Season 4 and early Season 5, he would go on to receive a few fairly minor nerfs. And now we hit patch 5.4, and oh man, what a patch. For a change that seems so small, it's actually crazy that this was by far the biggest nerf Kassadin ever received in his life. With a gutting of the range on his ultimate, Riot did exactly what they said they wouldn't by ruining his ultimate, his key defining feature. The rest of his abilities had already been nerfed into the ground over time, but the previous version of his ultimate was such an incredible ability that it could carry his entire kit to be strong, and after this nerf his win rate hit an all-time low of about 38%. But fortunately, Riot immediately realized their mistake, and on patch 5.5 he received a really significant buff that saw the cooldown on his ultimate lowered, which proved to be pretty reasonable due to the overall range nerf from before. He also received a visual update on this patch that came out with a new model, textures, animations, and all that good stuff. Even after this change, he was a little underpowered actually, and his win rate was super low, around 44% or even less for quite a while. He would go on to receive a handful of minor buffs throughout the rest of Season 5, and that leads us to where we are today. Kassadin right now is still a little bit underpowered actually, but with an ultimate like his, I think it's a good thing that Riot is being just a little bit hesitant with the buffs that they're handing out to him. He's had a lot of ups and downs, but for the last 10 months or so, things have been pretty quiet with Kassadin recently, and who knows what will happen to him in the future, but I'm sure we'll be seeing more of him eventually. And that's just about it. Here are some of my favorite comments from a previous video where I asked what your favorite item in League of Legends was. For a chance to be featured in a future video, leave a comment about what champion you think I should make a history for next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
Her body's gold like September. She burns through the night like an ember. And all those things we try forgetting, I remember. But we say we all fine, we all fine. Sunny day dreams and we up now.